My name is Daron Kennett, and this is the case briefing for DeShaney versus Winnebago County Department of Social Services. This was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court on February 22nd, 1989. Here are the facts of the case, which are a little difficult to talk about. In 1980, a divorce court in Wyoming granted custody of 1-year-old Joshua DeShaney to his father, Randy DeShaney. They then moved to Winnebago County in Wisconsin. In early 1983, an investigation of child abuse was conducted by the Department of Social Services, or the DSS. This was prompted by reports from police, caseworkers, and hospital workers. The case was dismissed, but Randy entered into an agreement for supervision. On up to 20 occasions in 1983 and 84, a social worker visiting the home reported child abuse, but no actions were taken. A hospital again reported child abuse in late 1983. No actions were taken. In early 1984, on 2 occasions, Randy refused to allow a social worker to see Joshua. In March 1984, Randy beat then 4-year-old Joshua so severely that Joshua suffered severe permanent brain damage. Joshua spent the rest of his life profoundly disabled in an institution. He died in 2015 at the age of 36. Randy DeShaney was convicted of child abuse and ended up serving less than 2 years in jail. Joshua's mother sued Winnebago County, the DSS, and DSS employees. They argued that by failing to intervene to protect him against violence they were aware of, they deprived Joshua of his 14th Amendment due process rights. So the issues of the case were these. First, does the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment require the state to act in cases like this? The Due Process Clause requires government actors to follow certain procedures before depriving a person of life, liberty, or property. Specifically, in this case, is the state liable for severe abuse when perpetrated by a private individual, especially when it's aware of the abuse? Even more specifically, what is the government's responsibility in protecting an abused child from a violent parent? So the holding of the Supreme Court by a 6-3 decision was that the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment is a limitation on the state's power to act, not a guarantee of safety from private harm, and therefore the state was not liable. It also specified, though, that there are some special relationships that do require affirmative duties to act. For example, if the person's in police custody in a prison, a situation like that. The legal rationale for that holding, which was written in the decision by then Supreme Court Justice Rehnquist, was that the harm was inflicted by Joshua's father and not the state. And therefore, the state had no constitutional obligation to protect him from that private violence. He reasoned that the purpose of the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause is to constrain the government from depriving people of life, liberty, or property, but not to compel it to act in their protection. And because the state had not acted to constrain the child's liberty in any way, for example, through incarceration, the state had no duty to protect Joshua. The DeShaney ruling established that the state's awareness of private violence does not automatically create an affirmative constitutional duty to protect. However, because Winnebago County created a Department of Social Services with the specific role of investigating and responding to instances of child abuse, it may be open to a lawsuit at the state level. It's worth noting that this decision is controversial to this day, and many legal scholars would argue that it was decided incorrectly, and they tend to point to Justice Blackmun's poor Joshua dissent when they talk about it. However, this ruling was upheld 13 years later in the town of Castle Rock v. Gonzalez. And that is the case briefing for DeShaney versus Winnebago County Department of Social Services.